So, you consider yourself a patriot, huh? Some sort of roughneck tough guy that would be willing to get your hands dirty to protect your country alongside your family, even if it costs you your money, well-being, status, or even your life. Pfft. Baka. Yeah, okay, buddy. Calm down. I get that you have some strong opinions on the state of the nation. However, today's man of the hour is actually totally the real deal, I promise. He had the nerve to follow through in his convictions to some ludicrous degree, even being shunned and prosecuted by his country in service to them, going above and beyond the call of duty to wage a campaign on his country's enemies on their soil. And committing several human rights violations in the process, like a real all-American badass and patriot. Hoorah! From combating feds and video hoaxes to his own private gitmo on Afghan soil ran by real American god warriors, we have a story of grit, daring, and a maxed-out speech skill with true lawful evil morality. And goddammit, you better thank him for his service, as he is clearly the most deadly super trooper to bless American soil in the last 4,000 years. And he was lying and LARPing about all of it. He was just some guy. The Patriot Pretender. Tora Bora Jack. And a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. Oh, sorry. Didn't hear you come in. I was too busy locked in on doing nothing whilst listening to my edgy trailer music, trying to spin the apple in my head diagonally in 4K. It's alright, I'll do it one day. Oh, is that not believable? Well, you clearly haven't been clued in on the quality of today's sponsor, Raycon. Raycon are the gold standard in wearable audio technology who are back just in time for the holiday season. So let me tell you what I appreciate most about Raycons. Raycon not only has the audio quality to rival the big boys and play my faux classical garbage in the most exquisite of bit rates, but it also boasts a 32-hour battery life and active noise cancellation, which means I could spend over a day straight locked in my own cinematic experience whilst blocking out the cursed holiday music that is playing in all of the shops right now, and most importantly, I can also block out the whinging and complaining of my staff who seem to take great pleasure in tormenting me about the type of music that I like to listen to, and also thinking they're being funny by including little sly digs at me in the sponsor ad reads. Because they're haters who think they're funny. But good thing I have my Raycons to drown them out. But that's not all, because with a sleek and ergonomic design alongside weather and sweat resistance, Raycon is rugged and reliable alongside high quality, all for an affordable price. They even have a wide catalogue of colours. How diverse. So, to get your hands on these sublime pieces of engineering right in time for the holidays, or possibly as a present for somebody else, you need only go to buyraycon.com/Dankula or click the link down in the description for up to 25% off. Again, that is buyraycon.com/Dankula or click the link down in the description for up to 25% off. Our story begins in the picturesque and strangely named town of Poughkeepsie, New York, where on May the 30th, 1956, we see the birth of one Jonathan Keith Edema. Not much is known about the lad's upbringing, other than the fact he was brought up in a based household. with the father being Master Gunnery Sergeant Hartman John Edema, a Marine who roughed it out with Tenacious Tojo on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Guam. That is to say, he was a mean mother hubber who probably got violently uncomfortable at the idea of ordering a Chinese, let alone the sight of an Asian. Clearly, having such heroes in the household must have instilled young Keith with a desire to enlist, serve and follow in the footsteps of his island-hopping and Nippon-stomping father. And it probably did play a part in it, but more so in the living in your dad's shadow sort of way. That, and Keith was really into John Wayne's Green Beret, a based Vietnam War film that actually subverted norms by being not limp-wristed and gay. Regardless, our boy stepped up, and it immediately gets complicated. You see, according to Keith, he enlisted in the US Army in February of 1975 at the ripe young age of 18. After graduating at the top of his class in high school, he quickly dazzled the army recruiters with his sheer brawn and physical prowess, despite being 5'9" and having atrocious eyesight. After enlisting, he managed to not only become a master parachutist, but he even managed to complete BUDS. Yes, that is right, our army recruit passed the test to become a Navy SEAL. Because that's totally how it works. He is just that good. Though there is some evidence that suggests that he faked all of this. Alongside this, he claimed that he was one of the very few operators to not only partake in the top-secret SOT course that they, quote, trained their elite ninja-type commando teams with, but that he also ascended to become, quote, one of the only 24 elite super-secret Hwarangdo warriors clandestinely trained at Fort Bragg. Both of those are real quotes. So, after 2 years of being the bestest super soldier ever, he then decided that maybe those blubber nuggets in the SEALs were totally bogus. So he decided instead to join the US Army Special Forces, or as you may know them, the Green Berets, serving for a meagre 22 years of combat training and 18 years of covert operations experience, all within a mere 12 years in the Special Forces. The math isn't really mathing on that one. After forcing his way out of the service, I can only assume that he got the whole regiment alongside the president to salute him as he was ceremonially leaving the service, because he's just such a badass American hero. Then there is his actual record, as attested to by his superior officers, who had the audacity to claim that Jack was, as a matter of fact, not the real-life G.I. Jack who served for over 20 years, but instead that his service was a short 3-year stint that was unimpressive, and in fact fraught with disciplinary and operational hiccups. According to a 3-page memorandum regarding imposter edema, it describes how he was partaking in uncouth behaviour, like refusing to obey orders, stealing food from his teammates during training, and how he had remarkably poor impulse control, being particularly prone to violent outbursts when put under the slightest bit of pressure, culminating in him attempting to physically assault a superior officer. It was so bad that in this memorandum there contains one of the most weirdly scathing put-downs that I have ever seen in official documentation, and it's from former colleague and superior Captain John D. Carlson. And it went like this. He was, without a doubt, the most unmotivated, unprofessional, immature enlisted man that I have ever known. He absolutely refuses to accept guidance, counselling, or supervision from any level of the chain of command. He is an extremely undisciplined individual who possesses the potential but refuses to even attempt to meet minimal requirements. This man's performance is continuously one step above punitive disciplinary action. That is to say, according to this report, Jonathan Edema is a stubborn, lazy, and overall unreliable bitch that couldn't be trusted to crawl out of bed in the morning, let alone be entrenched beside 12 other guys in a fucking war zone. But of course, that couldn't possibly be true. After all, Jonathan's dad said that he was a dedicated American, who, as a matter of fact, didn't do nothing but serve like a real rootin'-tootin' commie-shootin' patriot. Either way, he was honourably discharged and actually banned from re-enlisting in the regular force due to his obviously atrocious behaviour, and his court case, which we will get into later. However, he was allowed to rejoin as a reservist, spending another 3 years in the 11th Special Forces Group, valiantly reserving whatever was left of his presumably shattered ego. And let me just say, he made a very speedy recovery. After getting yet another scathing put-down from one of his former CEOs, Edema left the reserves and moseyed his way to the individual ready reserve, which, for context, functionally just meant that he was still a reservist, but just an atomised body that was not assigned into a group until he was needed. But anyway, look up the logo. It's actually pretty cool once you look past all of the weirdly occult symbolism. Edema must have been spooked by it though, because he ended up leaving all of it behind in literally 1984. After leaving the services altogether, he claimed to have been brought on as a special advisor to countries currently undergoing freedom like El Salvador. And he was also involved in a special mission unit in Honduras. And was he? No, probably not, because as you have all probably realised by now, Edema is somewhat of a serial liar. Though, what I can confirm is that he did work with the Thai military and he trained US embassy staff in Haiti. And as you can see, that obviously went very well.
Well, reason for the call today, John, is something just came across my desk, John. It is perhaps the best thing I've seen in the last 6 months. If you have 60 seconds, I'd like to share the idea with you. You got a minute?
Now, remember how I mentioned that our boy John Rambo was banned from re-enlisting due to a court case? Well, that was because our crybaby commando was actually something of an entrepreneur, having a keen interest in such manly trades as paintball and private security, making heckin' cool milsim gear for dipshit teenagers and 40-year-old man-children to get splatooned in, alongside supposedly giving expert training in counter-terrorism and advanced firearms training. Really quick, just because I do have to mention this, the short-lived paintball company Edema Combat Systems has potentially one of the most unapologetically boomer badass aesthetics going for it, with all of its products being in all black and having a stencil of a Rhodesian on it. Very swag, Mr. Enema. You definitely didn't just trace over the Man Amongst Men poster that you saw in Soldier of Fortune like a 12-year-old and then slapped it on all of your repainted grunge-wear military surplus bullshit. After all, this is totally what SEAL Team 6 uses when they're deployed. Bro, it totally is, I promise. Despite me taking the piss out of Keith's cringe hobby, ICS products are actually, from what I've noted during research, seen as quite valuable vintage pieces of kit in the paintball scene, for quite obvious reasons. Now, whether or not wearing such pieces of attire multiplies your risk of being shot, that's up for debate. Because I don't know about you, but I would actively gun for you if you were wearing something that fucking cringe. But I would still shake your hand afterwards. But now, on to the boring stuff. Edema also supposedly founded Counter Group. Nope, that's not a typo. In North Carolina, which supposedly specialised in, as previously mentioned, counter-terrorism, assault tactics, and specialised firearms training, whilst Keith and the instructors would all jaunt around dressed like Officer Nasty with their big tamper-tashes on full display. With the company having a main compound on an old airstrip, the clients would be expected to live on site whilst they undergo pseudo-commando training, whilst Keith and his business partner slash lawyer, William L. London, wander around looking tactical as fuck in what can only be described as a summer camp for patriots, with some other fun time activities including a study, so that you may learn about how to be a badass commando, a barracks so that you can learn to sleep like a badass commando, a weapons range so that you can learn to shoot like a badass commando, an abseiling station so that you can learn to walk on walls like a badass commando, and a rudimentary killing house a la the COD 4 tutorial, so that you can learn that you are not a badass commando. So, to put all of that trite rambling regarding countergroup into an easily digestible and supposedly comedic metaphor for our American audience, if Paris Island was Disney World, Countergroup's Red Hook facility was an underfunded yet overly eager Renaissance fair. One obviously has better quality results in terms of training and overall professionalism, but the other is definitely more fun, even with all of the cheesy LARPing.
One of them is the Counter-Terror Group Academy. Countered personnel demonstrated for us the type of training they give specific organizations that might have to conduct a hostage rescue. Counter Group has been in full operation since 1980 and has graduated several thousand from its various courses. Counter Group leader Keith Idema would not comment on what military units have used his facilities.
So remember how I said that Keith supposedly founded Counter Group? Well, we say supposedly because Idema, legally speaking, only had one company registered under him in North Carolina. That being Idema Combat Systems, the paintball company. And seeing as how the company's compound was actually in Red Hook, New York, despite the address being in North Carolina, paired with a constant stream of noise complaints and zoning violations, and you can see why certain government departments would look upon Keith's totally normal side hustling with a somewhat keen eye. Especially when taking into account the very presence of Idema himself alongside the nature of the company's services, which were apparently so well known in the area that Idema ended up suing the local newspapers because they called him a militant. Because it's apparently suspicious having a disgraced former Green Beret found what is in essence a training camp for warriors who didn't have any national allegiances. Soldiers without borders in an outer heaven, as it were. Why am I making a Metal Gear reference? Well, I don't want to make any outward claims at the moment, but just look at all of the pictures of Idema that you're going to see in this video, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Also, the lawsuit that Idema brought against the newspapers was dismissed. This will become a trend. In fact, speaking of Idema and the law, they got his arse for quite a few things actually. Like wire fraud, for which he supposedly finessed about $260,000 worth of money and assets from 59 separate companies and firms, alongside other such ravishing charges as impersonation of a police officer, passing bad checks, conspiracy, assault, and discharging a firearm into a dwelling. All of which were totally justified and they were totally asking for it, trust me. Of course, for every case levied against him, Idema retaliated in turn, whether it be the previously mentioned journos and his father, which is a whole thing that we might talk about later, don't worry about it, but more importantly, there was one case way later on where Idema tried to sue Steven Spielberg over Steven supposedly stealing the likeness of Idema and injecting it into George Clooney's character in the 1997 classic time waster, The Peacemaker. Yes, I'm being completely serious. He actually tried to sue the Hollywood director of the time because he thought that George Clooney was a bit too much literally me. That case was also dismissed and Keith was forced to fork over $267,000 to Slimy Steven. Womp womp. As you may expect by this point, Keith Edema was quite familiar with the judicial system, and he was particularly comfortable with the inside of a jail cell. It was when he had just finished serving 3 years for fraud that one of his colleagues would give him a rather interesting business opportunity. And let me just say that this little side gig ended up going nuclear. Jonathan Edema was approached by a colleague of his to help get him work in the newly liberated nation of Lithuania. Ah yes, Lithuania, the great country that is known for... Yeah, sorry Fabius, we don't give a shit about the Commonwealth. But anyways, after they were subjugated under evil alongside their Baltic kin, they ended up becoming the first autonomous republics to leave that satanic stain upon God's creation, colloquially known as the Soviet Union. And due to finally becoming an actually civilized state, they needed a police force that was actually able to police effectively, and not just disappear people alongside their entire families. As such, they brought in Western professionals to help reconstruct and effectively decommunise their entire government and judicial system. In what could only be equated to God's deep cosmic hatred for Lithuania, Edema ended up being brought into the country to train the police. To which, on the one hand, yes, that is patently absurd, as Keith Edema is the sort of uppity Facebook fogey that would probably oscillate his profile picture between the flag of the current thing and his fish-eyed mug in his car, all aviatored up whilst impotently gushing about how he just fucking loves Lockheed Martin, in between sips of Black Rifle coffee trying not to get stains of it on his Joe Rogan shirt. He was the type of guy that would listen to fucking Ben Shapiro's rap music and say that it was complete fire, and in the same sentence would deride all other flavours of contemporary music as pop music trash, like a boomer-toothed Anthony Fantano. But on the other hand, it is important to keep in mind that while he is a complete loser, he was still in the Green Berets, and, on paper at least, completely qualified to train people in the art of war. Paired with the fact that he, credit where it's due I suppose, gave off the gruff and cutting-edge aura of a highly trained and tempered special operator that, as we will see, ended up paying off for him in the worst possible way. Now, did Edema do a good job in Lithuania? We don't know, and frankly, I don't care. What we do know, however, is that upon his return to the United States, Keith immediately contacted the FBI and the Department of Defense, respectively, which would have come as quite a shock to them because the FBI was still actively investigating him for wire fraud. But was it about the wire fraud? No, instead, it was about how Keith used his street smarts and stealthy special training to uncover a dastardly plot to topple the US government in the country. How? Well, it was very simple. He not only managed to find his way onto the international black market, but he also came across a scheme perpetrated by the Russian mafia to sell rucksack-mounted micro-nuclear weapons to terrorists in an effort to detonate them in the United States. This is a surprisingly common myth. The idea that the post-Soviet collapse and greedy nature of the oligarchs meant that a few of the literal hundreds of Soviet nuclear weapons were sold off on the black market to help pay for their fifth Crimean villa. I mean, even Vice did one of their rare good documentaries on the concept of suitcase nukes. And before you say that that's completely infeasible and unrealistic, just look up the M29 weapon system and Greenlight teams for an insight as to just how horrifyingly portable nuclear weapons really are. And then contemplate that all of that shit was made back in the 60s. Which means it's probably very advanced now. But what made Edema's assertions different was simple. He claimed to have multiple high-ranking and high-trust informants that would be willing to testify to the veracity of his claims. This supposedly resulted in Keith having a confidential meeting with senior Pentagon official Timothy Conley about the situation. This then apparently led to another meeting with the aforementioned FBI and DoD, which, surprise, surprise, went absolutely nowhere. Because Edema was supposedly refusing to forward the names of his contacts due to the fact that he believed the FBI was compromised and infested with latent KGB assets, and that the informants would be put in jeopardy and potentially killed. He seriously didn't want to work with the United States intelligence services because he thought that there were too many spies in them, even though he was the one that contacted them. Anyways, according to Edema, this spell of federal trolling resulted in the United States intelligence agencies being purportedly so viciously ass-mad that they all colluded together in glowy solidarity to smear and besmirch his character with a bunch of totally fraudulent charges of wire fraud. Because, of course they did. That's totally what happened, and you didn't just finesse hundreds of thousands of US dollars so that you can play fucking paintball with your edgy 5th Prestige 80s villain jumpsuit. I didn't know where to put this in the video, so I've just stuck it here, but apparently Edema was disbarred from any business contracts with the army, due to the fact that he had misrepresented his business as being owned by a minority. To which I say that, despite the fact that Edema is Dutch in origin, Keith undeniably looks Italian. So, whether or not it was a misrepresentation is rather tough to say. Of course, Edema couldn't outrun the tendrils of the state. He ended up serving his time, whether it was due to a grand conspiracy or just his own greed. But it was during this time that there would be the grandest of paradigm shifts that would usher in the circumstances to bring in what Keith Edema is most well known for. It was on August 15th, 2001, whilst Edema was doing his usual thing of being in prison, that he came upon an unexpected windfall. A jury had actually awarded him a massive chunk of money due to a couple of property managers that he had hired who ended up being cheeky bastards and started mishandling and selling off all of his assets whilst he was in prison. How big was the payout? Just a paltry and modest $1.8 million in punitive damages. Though he never got most of it because the managers filed for bankruptcy, and as such, he settled for a mere $650,000. So, after getting out of prison, Edema finally managed to settle down a smidge. He got himself a woman, he got himself a dog, and he also had the ear of a movie producer by the name of Gary Skirka. Remember this name. So that he could get his totally non-embellished life story turned into a blockbuster action hit. Presumably putting that $650,000 into a house and finally learning to kick back a bit and rest upon his legitimately earned laurels. But then...
9/11.
Indeed, on September the 11th, 2001, the world that we grew up in stopped existing, happening right on American soil, in Edema's home state no less. As you're all very keenly aware, the World Trade Center was surgically demolished by a pair of planes going through it. The scale of this event was so far-reaching that they even managed to hit the Pentagon, conveniently destroying the accountancy wing. Tower 7 also collapsed as well, but don't worry about it. For many people all over the world, this event was to be remembered with horror and sorrow, burned into their minds as a senseless loss of life supposedly perpetrated by renowned Nepo baby gamer and shitposter Osama bin Laden. For others, however, this event understandably brought bubbling to the surface a desire for revenge, with enlistment rates soaring in hateful hysteria and egged on by the Bush administration. And Edema naturally wasn't any different, but rather than having me bloviate about his feelings and thoughts on the matter, let's consult his own writing instead. Like so many others, our lives were changed that day. But my destiny was clear. I would engage terrorists wherever they were, wherever they hid, wherever they ran. I would die before I let them do this again. Some people say that you write your own destiny, others say it is written for you before you're born. Bin Laden wrote mine on September the 11th, 2001. That means that everything that you're going to hear for the rest of this video is technically Bin Laden's fault. How dramatic, but does he have the moxie to actually follow through on his proverbial fatwa on Bin Laden? Well, seeing as he was banned from re-enlisting in the military and taking the fight through official channels, he instead decided to get in touch with veteran and owner of the non-profit Knightsbridge International, Edward Artis, with regards to a supposed documentary about them being done by our old friend Gary Skirka. The plan was that supposedly Gary and Jack wanted to embed themselves with the non-profit and document the majority veteran charity helping people in Afghanistan whilst the war was ongoing, showing the contrast between the Americans' stick and the carrot, good and evil and all that hokey-pokey shite. Sounds good, right? Well, you should all know by now that Keith was hardly truthful with his proposal. And instead, he merely wanted to use this as a pretense to actually enter the country with a camera so that he could record himself killing super terrorists and making himself a true American hero in the process. And he wanted to spend his first ever time in Afghanistan being the action star that he always wanted to be. But unlike an action star, this was all totally real and not dramatised. Ed Artis had suspicions from the outset, other than the obvious facts that Keith Edema didn't exactly fit the profile of a humanitarian or documentarian, and evidently got a little bit more outspoken, upbeat and involved when the camera was only pointed at him, including the time he shoved an aid worker out of the way so that he could get a cool selfie in front of the EKG machine. If that didn't set off alarm bells, perhaps the fact that he proclaimed upon landing in the country that he wanted, and I quote, to kill every fucking Afghan I see. That may have had Artis's alarm bells ringing a little bit. But summing up his thoughts with a mere 7 words, he's the dumbest fuck I've ever met. Keith Edema, who was now adopting his alter ego of Jack, was so unrelenting in his pursuit of cool action shots that it often came at the expense of his co-workers' well-being. Case in point, the incident when his partner in crime, Gary Skirka, got hit with shrapnel, nicking his right leg. Gary's co-workers were immediately all over him to ensure that the wound was dressed and that his arteries weren't gushing out his fucking life essence, because that would be somewhat of an obstacle to filming a good documentary. Then Jack shows up, and realising that he had missed the action shot, he immediately ripped off Skirka's fresh dressing and purposefully reapplied it whilst the camera was on to record his heroic deed. It's important to note that from everything that I have read, Jack has no experience or qualifications as a combat medic. So this little stunt actually ended up almost costing Skirka his life. So, to the surprise of absolutely no one, Jack and Gary ended up having a falling out as a result. With Skirka going back to the United States to recover, and with Artis fucking hating him, Jack was left alone and isolated in Afghanistan, with the documentary functionally being dead in the water. And adding insult to injury, Artis went to the effort of faxing the US authorities warning them about Jack, claiming this man is a very dangerous person by virtue of his carelessness and stupidity. And before he gets someone killed, possibly me or someone travelling with me inside Afghanistan, he needs to be removed from the area. Though, in fairness, Jack was probably on their radar by this point already. as he had already garnered a negative reputation within the Kabul media circuit for being a showboating scumbag, with one ABC's Eric Campbell summing up Jack like so. Jack is basically a nut, and none of the Special Forces guys in Kabul wanted anything to do with him. So, what was he to do now? Well, twiddling his thumbs in an ongoing war zone was, surprisingly enough, quite boring. So he decided to get off his arse, track down members of the Northern Alliance, the broad coalition of tribes that were staunchly anti-Taliban, network with them, and then approach them with enough swagger and military jargon to convince the humble Fremen that he was, as a matter of fact, a foreign military advisor that they had recruited. And shockingly enough, that actually worked. He had actually managed to embed himself in the Northern Alliance as an advisor, despite having absolutely fucking nothing to do with the current ongoing war. So, what did he do with his new position of relative power and influence? He formed and utilised his own militia to ferry journalists around at $1,000 per trip, bringing them to wherever there was action while simultaneously getting plenty of good PR of himself, dressing wounds and picking up random people's children. Being an overall cool action movie guy, but in the middle of an actual war zone whilst people are actually being killed. Like, he wasn't going to stop it or anything, but he was going to look cool as fucking shit while it was going on. Kinda like UN peacekeepers. Now, you might be wondering, surely there wasn't that much of a need for protecting journalists of all people. After all, it seems like war correspondents are borderline unkillable due to being that driven for the ultimate tragedy shot that they outright refuse death. Well, it turns out that, yes, actually, journos do bleed, as a few weeks before Jack's little enterprise, 4 journalists had actually been murdered the second they left for Jalalabad, because it turns out people apparently don't like them, especially in certain areas. One such hotspot was the complex of Tora Bora, the mountain fortress built into a sprawling cave network up north and famed stomping ground of Osama Sama. And yes, that is how we get the Tora Bora part of Jack's moniker, because he was often ferrying journalists around up there and often seen strategically milling around trying to look invested in shit. Due to Osama bin Laden supposedly being headquartered there, Tora Bora became the place of one of the most pivotal battles in the US invasion, with coalition forces and a healthy number of Northern Alliance troops bombing and then storming the vast cave network so they could get his autograph. Turns out he wasn't there. The slimy sand skimmer slinked out stealthily. So, despite the fact that they didn't get him, it still resulted in a fatal blow to Al-Qaeda, alongside a fuck-ton of Michael Bay-esque explosions and a dramatic finale to end the campaign. So, mission accomplished, I guess. As it turns out, journalists became rather fond of Jack due to him apparently upping their chances of survival in Afghanistan. As such, they had started to interview him. Because after all, this mysterious benefactor of theirs was not only evidently a super professional Black Ops commando and was cutting around Kabul in khakis, black shades and a jacket, whilst packing a holstered 9mm, you know, the stereotypical PMC get-up, but he was also incredibly talkative. Which is basically unheard of with those types. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been around any ex-Special Forces freelancers. They don't talk. They don't talk. They will not tell you a fucking thing. Mercs usually do have very tight lips and even tighter purse strings. Jack, of course, bucked that trend completely. In both respects. That fucker was gagging for an ego boost as well as funds to maintain his desert LARP. Jack became such a slut for slots on TV that between October of 2001 and June of 2002, his likeness and story had appeared in over 1,000 US newspapers and 250 TV shows at roughly $500 per appearance, thus increasing his funds and the circulation of his legend among the boomers. To the extent that I am unironically convinced that he might have been responsible for a minor bump in enlistment rates. Like, we're talking a fraction of a percent at most here, but still, for the US military immediately after 9/11, that's a fair bit. Of course, Jack was a hustler at heart, deftly pulling strings with his desperate journal clients to give them story after story, including one time when he managed to convince Northern Alliance warlord Hazrat Ali to actually sit down and give a press briefing to journalists in Jalalabad. Jack, being the greedy and sly fucker that he was, charged the reporters about $100 each to attend. And the kicker was that Jack lied. Again. Ali thought that he was actually giving a briefing to Pentagon officials. Jack told them that these journalists were Pentagon officials. And he's just revealing his plans to them. To the journalists. Of course, not everyone was lucky enough to see good Jack. Apparently, some journalists who were interviewing the legend ended up getting physically threatened. Like a reporter from Stars and Stripes who brought up his fraud charges, and in one case, fucking shot at after the journalist supposedly interrupted Jack. Nope, sadly I cannot elaborate on the context of that latter one because journalists tend to love recording every single detail until it actually gets interesting. But all you need to know is that from that point onwards, a good chunk of people on the scene started referring to Jack as Jack Shit and Mr. Potato Head. And no, that's not necessarily because of Jack's weird tic-tac Paul Blart physiognomy, but is instead due to the fact that he was just a generic operator guy who could just mould his entire identity into whatever he thought the journos would find most interesting at that moment in time. Whether it be a CIA spook, a virtuous vet with a bleeding heart, or a highly elite and secretive mercenary. All flavours of Seagal-esque 80s badass were achievable to our dear Jack. Another such hater who was absolutely seething about Jack's sudden stardom and success was our respectable friend Ed Artis, who started moulding by giving sneering statements like, "They ran story after story that furthered the cachet of a self-serving, aggrandizing criminal." Which is true. But at the same time, Ed Artis seems like he's just mad that the American public would rather hear about the warhawk cowboy over the principled pacifist. Cope, seethe, mould, and hydrate, I guess. Now, by this point, you probably have a very good idea of what type of man Jack Edema was. In terms of temperament and constitution, he was a swindling prick and malignant narcissist hell-bent on being the centre stage of any spotlight he could weasel his way into. He could, and often would, start shape-shifting his entire persona if need be to up his chances of getting that camera pointed at him. Eventually, however, Jack would start to slowly bite off more than he could chew. Not quite jumping the shark just yet, but he was starting to go through the motions. For you see, Jack had heard that all the major news channels operating in the area at the time had an active bounty for any footage they could grab of Al-Qaeda members in action. And wouldn't you know it, Jack just so happened to have 8 hours worth of it in the form of shitty cassette tapes. What are the chances of that? Very fucking low, actually, because indeed, Jack had decided to try his luck in forgery by manufacturing Al-Qaeda training footage and handing it off to journalists in return for money and even more airtime. His excuse for how he got a hold of such material? Well, he simply told them that he bought the lot of it off of his chums in the Northern Alliance, of course. And, like the good Samaritan he was, he immediately gave it over as an act of journalistic integrity. Because Jack Edema is a warrior who always gets the scoop. Except, not really, because you see, he gave over the rights to air the footage to the highest bidder, having the parasitic press scrambling to eat out of his hand for an undisclosed amount. Kind of base, to be entirely honest. However, I must reiterate that making shit up is in fact bad. Indeed, with hindsight, the tapes are rather erroneously Hollywood in nature, meant to show off how supposedly Al-Qaeda militants would be doing trick shots off of the back of moving bikes, how they had a fully operational killing house set up, and how they had the training and kit to do rappelling. All of the things that the famed private security firm Countergroup specialised in. What are the chances that they were doing all the exact same shit that Jack used to train in? It's fucking wild, isn't it? I mean, it almost seems like these were just a bunch of random poor bastard Afghans from the area that Jack made do all of this shit and then recorded it for money. But maybe not. I don't think that Jack would ever do something like that. But of course, Afghanistan wasn't forever, as the invasion entered its closing days, and with a transitional government set up to oversee freedom and shit, there was no real attention to give to the Afghan issue, at least for now. So Jack decides to pack up his shit and scamper on home, returning to Poughkeepsie right in time for his mother to pass away. After laying low, partaking in that Spielberg malarkey and presumably mourning, he got the opportunity to reconnect with one of his heroes. This being Robin Moore, the author of the book that started it all, The Green Berets. The book that the John Wayne film was based on, and the film that Jack is apparently based on. Now, you see, because Jack and Robin were both special forces guys, they already were cordial acquaintances with one another. But what made this circumstance rather special was that Robin wanted to write another book about Green Berets. This time about the outfit's daring operations and exploits in the freshly conquered and actually won, on paper at least, invasion of Afghanistan. And wouldn't you know it, Jack Edema was a former Green Beret that just informally partook in the US invasion of Afghanistan. Better yet, he was of course eagerly forthcoming about all of his achievements and operations in the region, because of course he fucking was. And thus we have come to the creation of the 2003 novel, The Hunt for Bin Laden, Task Force Dagger, which sounds like a mobile game, but as the name suggests, it recounts the hunt for the renowned gamer through the perspective of the supposedly Super Trooper Secret Soldier Squad known as Task Force Dagger. Jack's involvement with the book doesn't just consist of him being shirtless on the front cover, but also had him being brought in as a technical advisor. But when he read that Moore's initial draft wasn't quite Hollywood enough, he decided to posit his own rendition of the story, with added spice, spunk, and a lot of literary self-pleasure. Including, but not limited to, positing that he had almost single-handedly caught Osama bin Laden, and that he, as a matter of fact, had uncovered and foiled an Al-Qaeda plot to kill Bill Clinton. The best part of this entire book is not the abstract mental image of Jack Edema doing an Ouroboros, it was that he not only got royalties for this shit, but that he also included fraudulent charities for veterans and Afghan civilians in the back of the book that would all link to his P.O. box. Because it's Jack we're talking about. Naturally, despite the financial success of the book, the reception was critical, with almost every single person who was interviewed by Moore coming out against it for its lack of credibility, alongside our resident hater Ed Artis coming in for another dog pile. And because Robert Moore realised that his reputation was being irreparably harmed by Jack's made-up bullshit, he tried to amend and re-release the novel. When Jack found out about this, he flew into an absolute tard rage and sued literally fucking everyone because he got let go from Fox News as a permanent commentator over this spectacle. Who he also sued, by the way. As such, his revenue and ego were compromised and potentially in free fall. And yes, Robert Moore, his childhood hero, was also sued alongside his girlfriend for some reason. For how much, you might ask? Well, just a paltry $4 million. And shock horror, almost every single lawsuit that Jack had filed was thrown out of court. And it seemed that Jack was not taking it well, as according to one Chris Thompson, a former business partner of Jack's, Jack had apparently got so ass-mad that alongside the usual scumbag tard rage behaviour like fighting his girlfriend and choking that bitch out, as well as forging letters from Fox News to use as evidence in his case against them, he also proceeded to quite literally slice through chunks of his own house with a fucking katana. Yes, I'm being completely serious. You heard me correctly, a katana. Jack Idema owned, studied, and partook in the art of the blade. And yes, there is footage of him using this blade in a glorious 240p, with what sounds like a bit crushed audio snippet from The Last Samurai in the background, which, for copyright reasons, I can't play. So you have to suffice with watching this master of bullshido without the epic score.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer.
April of 2004 sees the release of the highly acclaimed political thriller Mean Girls, the birth of Gmail, and the return of Jack Idema to Afghanistan after 2 years of monkeying around and suing people. He came back to the country to help quell the upstart Taliban insurgency and help secure freedom or something. And because apparently Jack came across yet another devilish terror plot, this time involving 12 car bombs en route to the US Embassy in Kabul. Shockingly enough, the feds didn't act on this shite, so Jack started reflexively moulding. And then he started preparing. Cue, once again, Afghanistan. To finally achieve the goal of capturing Osama bin Laden, Jack Idema set out in a tard rage and brought with him 2 colleagues. Ed Caraballo, a frumpy cameraman from the Bronx who would be there to support and film his ego, and one Brent Bennett, a former US paratrooper who just decided to tag along with his new friend Jack, because something spirit of adventure. Upon touching down once more in the graveyard of empires, he proceeded to buy himself a swanky little compound in Kabul. Though officially it was to serve as his base of operations for a rug business that Jack was starting up, but once again, he obviously lied. Because you see, this little shitbox in Kabul was to be the HQ nicknamed the Honeycomb Hideout for what would functionally be his own paramilitary organisation. That being Task Force Sabre 7, a witty reference to the fanfiction that Jack had wrote with Robert Moore. Upscaling his operation, Jack acted upon the intel of supposed Al-Qaeda members that he seduced, and he enlisted the help of 4 Afghan God Warriors to join his cracked, battle-jacked Black Ops kill team. With specially procured uniforms and presumed training courtesy of Countergroup, alongside a hearty cache of smuggled and dubiously acquired weapons. Tora Bora Jack and his Diamond Dogs were now functionally a warband operating on Afghan soil with one goal in mind: find and kill Osama bin Laden. And holy shit did they act fast, because within mere weeks of landing in the country, Jack and his crew had broken into a supposed Taliban compound and abducted a supposedly high-ranking official, handing him off to coalition forces. Was this guy a Taliban official? Well, according to a press release from said coalition forces, no, he wasn't. Did Jack care? Not particularly. Because he's got yet another devilish plot to foil. That's right, he had yet another supposed car bomb plot to squeal about. This time getting tipped off by some cunt, doesn't matter apparently, about a supposed super terrorist named Gula Samke driving a bus into Kabul that may have been rigged with explosives. Standard deal. He contacted Defence Deputy Undersecretary Lieutenant General William Boykin about this information, and wouldn't you know it, Jack wasn't satisfied with the response. But this time, he took the initiative and dealt with the supposed plot by himself. And because Ed Caraballo was there, we actually have footage of it.
Once we pull the vehicle over, we empty everybody out, okay? Nobody deals with the women except for Zorro and Bo. Back there! Tell that guy, what's he? Is this the box? Stop that car! Nobody! Put your fucking hands up! I'll blow your fucking brains out!
Deciding to invite Gulam Saki into the back of his car at gunpoint, he decided to bring him over to his new gaff at the Honeycomb Hideout for a chill sesh of questioning. The result of this was Gulam Saki divulging the identity of one Sherjan, a taxi driver, alongside, if you wouldn't believe it, yet another fucking plot. This time, a conspiracy to assassinate high-ranking Afghan officials. So, in true Jack fashion, they decided to pay Sherjan a visit. And what they found inside the nice wee home was not only Sherjan himself, but also trace amounts of Semtex and detonators that Jack couldn't help but take the opportunity to start eating and sniffing. Because he's just like that. So, of course, Sherjan was in a whole heap of trouble. After all, he was not only guilty of a super serious plot, but he was also holding out on and hoarding Jack's favourite yummy treat. So, after a Swedish-Norwegian coalition EOD team sweeps the place, and true enough, they do actually find even more delectable Semtex, they let Jack take Sherjan back to the Honeycomb Hideout. And no, you did not mishear me, and I did not misspeak. A Swedish-Norwegian EOD team came in and investigated the place, all while Jack was standing there being aggressively 5'6" with illegally procured AKs and operating without clear oversight from any governmental organisation or body. And because they thought he was Special Forces, or as most people assumed, a spook, they just let him run off with this very important prisoner. That's one of the main reasons why Jack was able to get away with all of the shit he was doing. Everyone assumed he was a spook. And you can probably see how that has the opportunity to become very bad very quickly. Either way, Sherjan gets brought back to the Honeycomb Hideout and is harshly interrogated by Jack and his cronies over the course of a few weeks before letting him go free, into the arms of the coalition forces. And yes, there is also footage of all of these interrogations, but I'm not showing them because I'm already skating on thin fucking ice as it is, but also because a lot of them are quite boring, with it mainly consisting of Jack doing a tough guy voice while asking a bunch of questions to Sherjan through an interpreter, whilst Sherjan is sitting in a chair with a shamat over his head. Though there is much more graphic footage apparently floating around out there. But what's important to note is, this random guy, who's not Special Forces, he's not a spook, he's not CIA, he's not with any army, he's not coalition forces, he's just some fucking guy, right? A narcissistic serial liar, just some fucking guy, is currently running an illegal torture prison in Afghanistan. So Jack's little stunt and crying wolf actually paid off for once, and he took full advantage of it, interviewing and secretly recording the Afghan education minister, who was so happy about Jack thwarting the attempt in his life that he proceeded to lend Jack his security personnel. Because, indeed, it is a very educated move to enable Tora Bora Jack. This definitely won't end badly. Well, it didn't end badly just yet. Because just a few days later, Sabre 7, with help from German and Swedish units as well as the Afghan police, raided a house belonging to a Supreme Court judge who was thought to have some shady shit going on. A member of the judiciary who has skeletons in their closet, how unheard of. But anyway, they found yet more explosives and detonators alongside schematics. So this was another opportunity for Jack to take a victory lap. But this time, it would end up backfiring. After arresting the judge, he decided to go for a dinner party with the Kabul police chief. And that's not a euphemism, he literally had supper with the police chief and the director of the National Directorate of Security. Or in other words, the Afghan CIA. Our Jackie boy is making some powerful friends. Something foreshadowing. And just in case it wasn't obvious, the judge was also brought back to the Honeycomb hideout, which by this point was housing around 8 prisoners who were all being tortured and interrogated full-time by Sabre 7. Remember how I said that raiding the judge's house was going to end up backfiring? Well, get fucking ready.
Betrayal! You played us like a damn fiddle!
Wanted posters were put up by the US government all around Kabul because it turns out that Jack wasn't actually affiliated or sanctioned in any way by the Americans, despite his repeated claims that he was. And that once again, Jack's eternal enemy, the FBI, had tipped off the US military about his antics stateside. This caused Jack to naturally fly into yet another turd rage, and he decided to record himself ringing up Lieutenant General Boykin to sneed about it on camera.
When they find out that the guy that captured all the terrorists that were going to blow up Bagram, you shouldn't be giving me a fucking DSM. Instead, they're putting a wanted poster out for me. You think... I don't know what happened.
Boykin presumably got tired of his shite and finally brought the hammer down. As on July the 5th, 2004, the Honeycomb hideout was raided by Afghan police and all of Sabre 7 was arrested. The police found inside 8 prisoners in varying states of distress, to put it lightly, with some being bound, others being hung by their feet, torture equipment and bloodied rags strewn all over the compound. The prisoners, upon being released from their dingy confines, immediately came forward and stated that they were forced to give false confessions to crimes that they had not committed. I mean, on the one hand, of course they would say that, but on the other, I think it's been well established that Jack is a bit of a shite bag, even despite being occasionally successful. Remember how I said that Jack ended up making powerful friends? Well, those powerful friends were not fucking happy with him, because Sabre 7 were transferred to a jail ran by the NDS. Sabre 7 was subjected to extreme and immediate irony as they were tortured during their stay in jail, being subjected to having their feet beaten. I don't know, it's a weird Afghan thing. I mean, it makes sense insofar as you're fucking with the guy's ability to walk properly, but at the same time, here's Ed Caraballo showing off his sweaty toes and fucked up bruising in the middle of the court. Bennett, Caraballo and Jack were all charged with illegal entry, running a private prison, robbery and torture. Considering the fact that they were running what was, in essence, their own paramilitary that was informally colluding with the coalition forces, these charges seemed a little bit fucking favourable, actually. Did they do it, though? Well, I don't know. Innocent until proven guilty and all that. I mean, it's not like there is hundreds of hours of video footage of literally fucking everything that they did. So naturally, Jack was moulding and being based and spouting off about the journos and their lies to the journos, even though they were actually telling the truth for once.
How have you been? How's it been in there?
None of you tell the truth, you all fucking lie, so... What's your message?
So, what masterstroke defence did Jack and his crew have lined up? Well, they claimed to the press that they had in fact informally been given the green light to operate in the country by the Pentagon and the CIA, and that they indeed did have piles and piles of video and audio recordings to prove it. To which Yet there was a lot of proof, including multiple interviews and statements from the Education Minister and Lieutenant General Boykin, that really did build the picture that Sabre 7 were, at the very least, a known variable that the United States let run loose for a little while. Then, according to Jack, the FBI seized almost all of the footage. What are the chances of that, eh? You know, all of this super convenient video evidence that would have been crucial in your defence just got miraculously seized right when you needed it the most. Well, it is true that the FBI did seize a lot of the footage, even though this was not their jurisdiction at all, but at the same time, I frankly don't know if there was any amount of evidence that could get Sabre 7 out of this hole. And obviously, it goes without saying that Jack didn't take this betrayal, or more importantly, the loss of all of his cool action hero B-roll, super well.
How do you feel about being sort of let go by the Americans?
You can't use that quote.
Well, there you go. That's the quote, my dear.
You see, there were some slight concerns before the trial even started in earnest. Mainly the fact that due to the current Afghan regime only being a couple of years old by this point, the legal system was rather underdeveloped. And that was made even worse by the fact that a Supreme Court judge was literally their prisoner. Alongside the fact that human rights groups were kicking up shit over the fact that Sabre 7 were confirmed to be subjected to torture and overall subpar conditions in jail. To which, sure, no shit, they almost certainly deserved it, but at the same time, it does set a bad look for the US-backed Afghan government to be torturing US citizens, especially those who presented themselves as good, God-fearing American patriots who were helping to stop the terrorists. Of course, the US government had to come out and formally deny any connection whatsoever, whilst also conceding that, yeah, they did kinda get given a prisoner by Jack. But they were like totally super sus about it and stuff.
The coalition did receive a detainee from Mr. Edema on 3 May. This detainee was held by the coalition for approximately a month and released once we recognized that the detainee was not, in fact, someone we were interested in. We took the detainee in the first place because Mr. Edema represented him as someone that we were interested in. Once we determined that was not the case, we released the detainee immediately. I would treat with a great deal of skepticism any claim by Mr. Edema that he was working for the U.S. government. I can tell you absolutely that he did not work for the coalition. He was not in our employ at any time. We did not give him taskings or missions. And in this event where we did accept the person, we did it as we would have accepted any terrorist who we were interested in taking out of commission.
And in fairness to the US establishment, all of this could not have come at a worse time, because Sabre 7 got raided just mere months after the massive scandal at the Abu Ghraib detention centre, which is definitely a topic for another day. Oh gee, what a lovely young woman that Lindy England appears to be with her cute little dog. You should definitely thank her for her service, and definitely don't look up her name or Abu Ghraib and then go to the image section. You definitely should not do that. Made even more comical was the fact that the actual courtroom itself was haphazard, unprofessional, and underprepared, with there being no cross-examination of witnesses and with the judge being inconsistent with letting the defence team do things like read their fucking statements, which was made even worse when you realise they're defending fucking Jack Edema. This entire time, Jack was just sitting in his Seagal shades whilst constantly interrupting people and showboating to the press, in between taking drags from his off-brand Marlboros whilst the courtroom shuffled the only microphone they had between everyone in the room. The whole courtroom only had one microphone. So anytime anyone had to speak, they had to send this one poor guy around the room to everybody in the courtroom. There was only one microphone for the entire thing. Oh, the whole trial was a fucking shit show. Ed Caraballo tried to weasel his way out of getting charges over the fact that he was totes a journalist and therefore was eligible to get amnesty. Except for the fact that, lol, no, this is fucking Afghanistan, and also because he was legally under Jack's employ in a non-journalistic capacity, and was therefore exempt from any kind of amnesty. Then there was Brent Bennett. The other one. He literally just didn't even have a lawyer and was by and large just ambiently hovering around, looking bewildered and lost like Jack and Ed's stand. Like a cross between Walter Jr. and Hierophant Green. So it's fair to say that realistically, these guys had absolutely no chance of walking out of that courtroom as free men. But a ray of hope glimmered in their eyes as the FBI gave the courtroom the footage back halfway through for presentation. But Jack and his team claimed that there were snippets that were kept from release on purpose. Regardless, whatever footage was given over and shown in the courtroom, did it result in Sabre 7 dodging a guilty verdict? Did it fuck? But what can be said is that it indeed showed the entire world that the US government was aware of Jack's antics and were at the very least permissive about it when their interests aligned. And that when he outlived his usefulness, they washed their hands of the entire thing. And so, on September the 15th, 2004, after a whopping 5 minutes of deliberation, the judge handed out the verdict of guilty to all of the men in Task Force Sabre 7, with Jack and Brent Bennett getting 10 years each, whilst Caraballo got a mere 8 years and the Afghan helpers getting around 5 years each for, in the eyes of the government, being metaphorical house-swilligers. So next stop, Paramilitary Prison. Now, don't get it twisted, it turns out that Sabre 7's friends on the inside did come in clutch along with maybe some bribes. Mainly in terms of their prison arrangement. These guys got the Escobar treatment, with a whole wing of the Paramilitary prison complex dedicated just for the boys of Sabre 7, complete with laptops, phones, satellite television, books, booze, and even dedicated assistants. Like, it was so good that you could almost completely forget about the horrific shit that these guys did on the outside. Or the time that a literal firefight broke out in the prison and one of Jack's boys got killed alongside 4 others because everyone in the prison wanted to kill them. But I mean, that's whatever when you get to premiere with the boys in a scuffed MTV Cribs knockoff.
It's an unusual treat. Help yourself into the prison.
Don't take a picture of me, goddammit, right now, so I put my shit on. I'll fucking have to shoot you. Alright.
Good.
The place is a little fucking messy right now. This is Esmarai, Major Esmarai, was the first base of the Panjshir.
Hello?
He was one of the guys captured with me. Dean Mohammed, he's very famous Mujahideen. You can see he got the shit shot out of him by the Russians. So for 20 years, he's been fighting the Russians and Taliban.
Whilst in prison, Jack kept himself entertained by, of course, suing even more people, alongside writing and uploading shit to his newly created website, superpatriots.us, and I'm absolutely fucking gutted that that website doesn't exist anymore. The contents of which consisted of footage of himself alongside his version of the story that, of course, had a lot of self-glazing. There was also a YouTube channel that at one point had multiple uploads of Jack drunk and doing dumb bits in 240p whilst looking like an Anglo-Angry Joe. But of course, it was not to last forever, as sadly his stay in prison was set to come to an end due to the Afghan government being evil shits that granted Jack amnesty. However, Jack quite literally refused to leave the prison, demanding that his passport, personal belongings, documents, and Bennett's dog be given to him alongside a paycheck of $500,000 for damages and equipment that he lost when it got confiscated. He was of the belief that the documents he wanted reclaimed actually had undeniable proof that the US government was colluding with him. So did that go anywhere? No. And what about the dog? Well, Nina was found wandering the prison grounds as a pup and was then adopted and raised by the wild man Bennett. After hearing of Jack's amnesty, they presumably came to an agreement that the only way to get the dog out of prison and out of a Muslim country, you know, famous for being very fucking horrible to dogs, was to go with Jack. Yes, we do know who let the dogs out. It was the Afghan government under Hamid Karzai.
Snake, try to remember some of the basics of CQC.
Now a free man, Jack settled down in Mexico. Why Mexico? Well, he went there due to the outstanding arrest warrants against him in the United States. But he decided that a shake-up to his image was in order. So he decided to adopt the overall aesthetic of a crust punk biker. The type of guy who would be rocking his shit to Bad to the Bone whilst ripping heaters off of his Dragula, flicking beads of sweat infused with his shitty hair dye with every headbang. It was around the latter portion of his stay in prison that Jack started correspondence with a fair maiden by the name of Penny Alessi. I'll get into what happens with her in a moment, but just keep in mind that she's kicking about now as a recurring character. Initially renting a condo, Jack would end up having to move due to being arrested over drug dealing. Because of course he was in Mexico after all. After a brief stint in jail, he found himself in the Yucatan city of Bacalar, where he decided to buy a literal mansion to play house flipper IRL. With a mighty amount of moxie, he spent a considerable amount of time, effort and money on not only cleaning the dilapidated place, but also installing a completely self-reliant plumbing system and a massive suite of security improvements, including hiring a full security detail to keep watch over his palace and organising drills for the house to go through in certain emergency scenarios. It's almost like he was expecting the US government to send in the SEALs or some shit to drag him out of there. Of course, just because he was knee-deep in construction, it doesn't mean that the hustle has to cease. Of course not, because Jack had already started scheming about his next business venture. It seems that due to the isolated nature of his fortress of solitude, that logistics became his newest obsession. And because he was a little boy at heart, it was specifically military focused, with the venture to be being the incredibly gringo-coded Star America Aviation Company. And no, it didn't go anywhere. Apparently due to the fact that despite having the manpower, funding and clearances from the US government, Jack seemingly didn't have the follow-through to actually go anywhere with it. Probably because of the fact he doesn't know a fucking thing about planes, let alone military aviation and air cargo. So instead, he stuck with something a grug like him could understand. Boats. Getting himself a cute wee pontoon boat, he founded Blue Lagoon Boat Tours. No, they did not open a chippy on a shippy. Instead, they were, as the name suggests, giving out tours to view the picturesque lake views of the Yucatan jungles. They even had a corny pirate theme where Jack basically larped as Jack Sparrow. And apparently he started going by the name Jack Black, because according to him, it sounded like a cool pirate name. Maybe a bum pirate. Speaking of which... But, as it turns out, this whole pirate and wider Mexico malarkey wasn't really working out for old Jack, with the boating business not making any profits and the constant spats he would get into with the local government. Our wee pirate needed a source of income. Then, wouldn't you know it, his dad was on the cusp of death and had a rather scrumptious estate for Jack to inherit. It turns out that they had a massive falling out over the years and were seemingly not on speaking terms. Until it came to the inheritance, of course. Then Jack got very chatty. So it turns out that throughout the 90s, when Jack was going through his first entrepreneurial blitz, that the man who was bailing him out time and time again was none other than his own father. even establishing the shell company Isabel Dakota in his own name to help Jack dodge creditors for his own antics at the cost of tanking his own credit rating. This naturally soured Gunny Edema to any prospects of money being involved with his scumbag son. But don't you fret, my little Jack-Jacks, Junior has a plot brewing to take that inheritance. In steps Penny. The plan was simple. Marry Penny so that he could have everything in her name and conveniently sidestep all of those nasty and inconvenient little issues with collecting that inheritance. And wouldn't you know it, just 3 days after Penny and Jack get married, Gunnery Sergeant Edema popped his clogs and died. Talk about opportune timing, Jackie boy, and just like that, he gobbled up all the funds from his father like the little fucking leech he is. By this point, it's quite evident that as the years grew on, Jack started notably degrading in terms of cognition and behaviour, seemingly growing more and more paranoid about basically everything. Between the citadel he was constructing out in the middle of the Yucatan jungle to his weird drills that he would force everyone to carry out at 2 a.m, to the fact that he had a gun on him at all times, including under his pillow and in a bag that he would take into the shower with him, alongside spending most of his extracurricular time perfecting his skills with the katana. Now, you might say, it is Mexico to be fair. And sure, Mexico isn't exactly Switzerland in terms of safety, but it's important to remember that he was in the Yucatan Peninsula, literally one of, if not the safest areas in the country and a massive tourist hub. He was also tucked out of the way in the deep sticks in a literal fortress. He had no reason to act like he was living amongst gangbangers in Juarez. He frankly wasn't high profile enough to be of interest to fucking anyone. Not that it didn't stop him from losing his marbles and mingling with some certain things that his friends in Afghanistan would very much tut at. For example, due to the little scheme involving his father's death and inheritance, his declining faculties were only accelerated, doing the classic move of finding a funky new chemical to snort or smoke and buying an obscene amount of it, which only accelerated his downward spiral and enriched his dark triad with an addictive streak. Another example is that after Penny had outlived her usefulness, he separated with her and started organising orgies and advertising them on gay hookup sites, having particular interest in fucking around with and having relations with one Nancy, a ladyboy prostitute. Because it seems that by this point, Jack Edema had succumbed to the same primordial jungle spirit that inhabited John McAfee. However, it did seem like God did not approve of Jack's betrayal of Penny or his turn towards sodomy, because on the same day that Penny had left the country, Jack and his new boy lover Nancy got into a very bad car crash that almost killed them. With multiple broken bones, a fractured skull, and a collapsed lung, Jack suddenly found himself on the precipice of the uncaring void. And so, he frantically rang up Penny to apologise about his degenerate orgies, and most importantly, left all of his assets to her. In a show of compassion and human decency, Penny returned to Mexico immediately to help him recover. She shouldn't have done that. Jack responded to this act of good morality and virtuousness by being unthankful and bitchy, abusing, amongst other such things, pain medication, the Max Payne flavour of addiction. And then, after Penny started getting noticeably ill, Jack told her, "Oh, by the way, I've got HIV, you should probably get tested." She tested positive. Jack abandoned her, then she came back to take care of him, and her reward for her good graces was HIV. Jack is one of the biggest fucking scumbags I have ever covered on this channel, and I've fucking done a video on Uday Hussein. Right, he's not as bad as Uday, but he's up there. He's very, very close to Uday Hussein. This guy is just a massive fucking scumbag. But in return, God once more punished Jack by revealing that Penny's condition could be stabilised to the point where she could live. But Jack was a lost cause and was to die in the very near future. Naturally, Jack flew into yet another tard rage. This resulted in Jack further leaning into his acts of wanton depravity, with the amount of drug ingestion and gay bum sex skyrocketing, and in return worsening his state of being mentally and physically. With it getting so bad that Nancy went down to Mexico once again to try and collect Nina and their cat out of concern that they were being uncared for. This ended up becoming so volatile that it ended up with Nancy apparently holding up Jack at gunpoint with the intent to kill him. Jack disarmed her and then beat the ever-loving shit out of her. Whilst she was left bleeding out on the floor, she managed to get a hold of a phone and call for help. And you wouldn't believe who showed up to assist. But we'll get to that in a second. Jack then proceeded to drug and torture Penny over the course of days, which, alongside the standard stuff of beating her, apparently included doing things like grabbing a burlap sack full of mice, which she had a phobia of, and tying it around her head. Jack then tried to interrogate her and in a drug-fueled haze was screaming at her, asking her who she worked for. So in steps two members of the US Embassy looking to do a wellness check on Jack and also hopefully rescue Penny from the obviously horrific situation that she found herself in. And who tipped off the embassy about the kidnap and torture? None other than fucking Ed Caraballo, the journalist who documented Jack back in Afghanistan and was in prison with him. Despite the best efforts of Jack to intimidate Penny into acting normal in front of the men, Penny managed to tip off the gents that she wasn't exactly doing too well. They fuck off, seemingly getting the gist of what's going on, presumably tied up with red tape. Jack then finally realises what's happened and proceeds to repeatedly waterboard Penny over the course of days. It wasn't until a plumber comes by and actually lifts her out that she finally manages to escape and get in contact with the police. They proceed to put her into protective custody and get her on a plane back to the US pronto, whilst they get ready to press charges against Jack. And no, she didn't get the pets back. Naturally, this became headline news, with even renowned arrogant smug boy moder Rachel Maddow freely taking potshots at Jack, to which Jack responded by flying into yet another tard rage. However, due to being out of direct reach of Penny, he instead proceeded to harass and stalk her via phone and text, as well as snarky websites like PennyIsAwhore.com. Penny was left unable to afford her AIDS medication due to Jack opening multiple credit cards in her name and overdrawing on all of them, fucking up her credit rating, alongside posting revenge porn of her on multiple blogs and even emailing it to her parents. All of this, including a whole swathe of court cases involving Isabel Dakota that I frankly just can't be fucked getting into, proceeded on until January of 2012, when Jack Edema succumbed to his boy love blight and finally died, unceremoniously and abruptly, for once in his life away from a camera. So, where does that leave us? Tora Bora Jack was an absolute fucking scumbag, especially in his later life, but I can't help but find myself hating almost everyone involved in this story, because for whatever reason they became so enthralled with his mystique that they enabled Jack into existence. Everyone from the US government to Gary Skirka were apathetic at best to his fucked up behaviour, and they were willing to overlook it for a good scoop or an extra legal asset to help further their interests in the region without the need for accountability. Jack was what people wanted to see him as. A good, God-fearing, wartime door kicker who got results regardless of the immorality along the way. A larger-than-life character with a personal vendetta against a man who almost everyone in the nation wanted dead. Patriotic and virtuous without all of those restrictive checks and balances. A Rorschach for the American people in the post-9/11 paradigm. There were, of course, people who ended up seeing right through him, namely Ed Artis and Ed Caraballo. Eventually, of course, Penny as well. Speaking of which, the King of Stolen Valor by OK has been nothing short of an absolute godsend in collating all of the disparate data on Jack into a coherent timeline. And frankly, I would never be able to one-up it. However, it is worth noting that I have not covered all of Penny's story. This is not due to a lack of interest or due to a lack of time constraints. Fuck no, we could make this an even longer video if we wanted and have our editor suffer through the toils of editing for even longer and maybe have him stop watching children's cartoons when he's supposed to be fucking working, but instead, I've abstained from delving into her account because frankly, I could never tell the story as well as she herself could, to which she graciously does in said documentary. If you would like to hear more details on her story, then I implore you to do so. Though I do warn you in advance, it's frankly just as harrowing and depressing as what I just covered. And you should also support OK for actually being a documentarian and not just being a wiki-pushing slot poster wrapped under far too many layers of irony. Anyway, as a final thing on Jack, yeah, he really wasn't a good man. That much is obvious. But in fairness, he was really fucking photogenic, wasn't he?
It's Count Dankula on YouTube! Everybody just subscribe!